Now we'll take a look at a high-level example from the European Championship 2012 between Inarkiev and Ivan Sokolov, featuring the pawn structure where black exchanges on d4 and fianchettos his dark square bishop. So the game began with a Rai Lopez, and Sokolov has been perhaps the main pioneer of various alternatives in this position. He wrote an excellent book on options which black has here, from bishop c5 through f5 through knight g7. Here he selects knight g7 and knight c3, which I think was recommended by Sokolov in his own book as the most dangerous continuation, was picked by Inarkiev. So Sokolov played d6, d4, a6, bishop e2, and now, in view of, I suppose, the slightly uncomfortable threat of d5, Sokolov decided to exchange on d4. It was perhaps possible to do something else along the lines of, for instance, knight g6, d5, knight c7, but certainly black is struggling for space there. So Sokolov decides to make this clarifying exchange in the center while trading one pair of knights, which ordinarily should favor black. And another aspect of this is that because the white queen is chased off this diagonal, black is able to play g6 and develop his bishop actively to g7. So Inarkiev dropped back to d3, g6, and this position had actually already been played in a Croatian tournament in 2011 between Palac and Stevic, where the game continued with bishop e3, bishop g7, castles, and black was basically all right. This bishop is very actively placed. The knight is controlling important dark squares in the center. Black has exchanged one minor piece, so his spatial disadvantage isn't so significant. And overall, I think this would be a position which black would be happy to play. Inarkiev chose a much more targeted continuation with h4. And now we begin to see actually that black's position, as so often happens when you embark on an ambitious strategic plan right in the opening, it suffers from a kind of lack of development, because white has developed two minor pieces, his queen's already developed, and now this rook is effectively being developed along the h-file, whereas black has only developed one piece so far. And so black needs to play with a certain amount of precision to avoid getting a very difficult position, and in fact it's possible that this position already is just very good for white. Sokolov continued bishop g7, which is the most natural move. Bishop g5, always a useful inclusion, because after f6, bishop e3, the bishop on g7 has been temporarily blocked by the f pawn. Now, it could be that black plays f5 later, in which case you could argue that, if we just put this here, you could argue that the game would effectively transpose into positions after bishop e3 if black subsequently plays f5, but that's not the whole story, because clearly with a pawn on f6, black has an additional incentive to play f5 because his bishop is blocked. So black is effectively committed to plans based on f5, whereas with the pawn on f7 he could consider other things. So this is just a useful inclusion for white. Now black played bishop e6, knight d5. Now, one of the aspects of this pawn structure, which is quite easy to overlook, is that white has what is effectively an outpost on d5, because if black were ever to play c6, then he'd have a weak pawn on d6. So ordinarily speaking, it's quite difficult to remove a white piece which lands on d5, and here the knight is certainly very well placed. Sokolov played queen d7, just flexibly not committing his king, white castled queenside. And now black played f5, which again is probably the best move because, as I mentioned previously, black almost certainly has to play f5 at some point in order to free his bishop. But at the moment he's remaining flexible with his king as to where it goes. Now Inarkiev notes that castling queenside immediately is possible when he gives h5 his best during the game. He thought that this move, queen a3, was extremely strong, menacing bishop takes a6. But actually, as he notes, black can hold on here. Queen f7 takes king d7. Queen b7, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight e5. Now it looks like white's attack is running out of steam, but he does have an extra resource, which is f4, rook d8, now the temporary queen sacrifice by taking on e5. But in fact, after rook takes b7, e6 check, takes, we just reach an endgame which is basically level. But certainly you could understand that perhaps Sokolov was also concerned at this variation, and in any event, if he had castle queenside, white could just continue as in the game with h5. So after f5, white plays h5, and now again Inarkiev recommends that black should have castled queenside, although he says that white has a solid advantage after h6. Can see that this pawn is a big strategic asset for white. Clearly, if anything were to happen, such as the g6 or h7 pawns would be removed subsequently, that pawn is very close to the queening square. In the meantime, the rook is activated behind it. And all of white's pieces are just more active than their black counterparts. And the final aspect, I suppose, is that this bishop is now in some trouble. So even after castling queenside, I think black would struggle. Computers seem to like castling kingside, but this can be rejected effectively on site because white just has a very attractive attack along the h-file. For instance, he can exchange on g6, seek to exchange the dark square bishops by bishop h6, and it's not a position you want with black. So Sokolov chose knight e5. Now queen b3 creates a threat on the b7 pawn, and black felt compelled to take on d5. If he were to castle, then h6 would be even less pleasant than in the variation at move 15, because this bishop is now severely limited. So bishop takes d5, but now after queen takes d5, castles queenside. As Inarkiev notes, this position would always be better for white, if nothing else because he's got two bishops, more active pieces. In particular, the rook on h1 is extremely active on the h-file. The rook and queen on the d-file can't complain either, but he actually has a specific move to disorganize black's defenses with bishop g5, which is very unpleasant. And from here he gives rook df8 as the only kind of saving resource, but after h6, bishop f6 takes f4. Black's position is beginning to collapse because his knight has no stability in the center, and he needs to watch out for e5 when suddenly the queen and rook on the d-file come into their own. Instead of that, Sokolov played c6, queen b3, and now rook df8. But now after f4, we see that in fact black is really struggling for squares with his pieces, and in part because if he were to move this knight, then h6 would collect a piece. And Inarkiev also gives knight g4, e5 is winning. So with a threat to the d pawn and another threat to play h6. So after f4, Sokolov tried to confuse matters with h6. But now after takes, rook takes d6, white's already a pawn up. And with some overwhelming activity, basically, I suppose the last question is whether he can bring this bishop into the game effectively. So black played queen c7, rook d1, and decided to challenge this rook on d6. Clearly, rook d7 is a threat when if the queen were to give itself up for both rooks, the b7 pawn would fall, and with it perhaps the g7 bishop. So rook d8 is logical, but now, white simply takes on g6, and now this pawn is extremely strong. And Sokolov found nothing better than king b8, and then exchanges on d8, bishop takes a6, and the black position is really collapsing here. An interesting transition from Inarkiev, who notes that the point of taking on b7 is that after king takes e6, the bishop can't stop both the pawns. So instead, black goes into an opposite color bishop position, but there's a limit to how many pawns you can be down in an opposite color bishop position. And after this one, given that black is currently 4 pawns down, including 3 connected pass pawns, it's unsurprising that after a few more moves, Sokolov decided to call it a day here. So a game which I think is very fresh. I mean, a novelty on move 10 in a position which is not in the theoretical mainstream, but a very good example of targeted white play against the early exchange on d4 and black playing g6. It's a maneuver which will always take a certain amount of time as compared to simply bishop g7, and the very quick activation of the rook with h4 and h5 was sufficient to pose very considerable defensive problems in this game.